4 astronauts just spent 10 days flying around the moon, traveling farther into space than any human being in history, farther than any Apollo crew ever went, watching Earth and the moon shrink and grow in their windows in ways no living person had ever personally witnessed before. And when they splashed back down into the Pacific Ocean this past April, they didn't just complete a historic flight, they kicked off what NASA itself has openly called a race, not simply to land on the moon again the way Apollo did more than 50 years ago, but to actually stay there permanently this time, building something that's never existed before, a real functioning human outpost on another world. And in this video, I want to walk you through exactly what NASA is actually planning, how realistic the current timeline genuinely is, and what the first human settlement on the moon might actually look like as it develops over the coming decade. So let's start with exactly where things stand right now, because there's real, substantial, current progress worth understanding accurately. In April of 2026, Artemis II successfully flew 4 astronauts, Christine, a Koch, Victor Glover, Reed Wiseman, and Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen, around the moon and back, a crewed test flight that didn't land but proved out the core systems. The Orion spacecraft, its life support, its navigation, needed for an eventual landing, and that mission had genuinely been delayed multiple times before it finally launched, originally targeted for 2023, pushed to 2024, then 2025, then twice more within 2026 itself due to technical issues including hydrogen, leaks, and I think that specific delay history is genuinely worth keeping in mind as we walk through the rest of this video, because it's directly relevant to how we should actually think about every future date NASA announces going forward. And just weeks after that successful Artemis II flight, in May of 2026, NASA announced something genuinely significant. Its first concrete moon-based contracts, awarding hundreds of millions of dollars to a handful of private companies, specifically to begin building the actual hardware a lunar base will need. Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' space company, will provide landers specifically to deliver lunar rovers to the surface. Astrolab and Lunar Outpost were awarded a combined $439 million to build and deliver those lunar terrain vehicles. Essentially moon buggies, astronauts will actually drive across the surface, and Firefly Aerospace, the same company that successfully landed its own Blue Ghost spacecraft on the moon last year, will deliver the first drones specifically. Designed to operate on the lunar surface, and this entire push follows a formal executive order specifically directing NASA to establish the initial elements of a permanent moon base by 2030, backed by a genuinely substantial $20 billion plan. And I want to walk through NASA's actual current plan in some real detail, because it's considerably more specific and developed than a lot of people probably realize. The base itself is planned for the moon's south pole. Specifically, and that location isn't arbitrary at all, it's chosen for 2 genuinely critical practical reasons. First, permanently shadowed craters in that region are believed to contain substantial deposits of water ice, accumulated over billions of years. And that ice represents an enormously valuable resource, not just for drinking water, but potentially for producing breathable oxygen and even rocket fuel directly on site, dramatically reducing how much material would otherwise need to be hauled all the way from Earth at enormous cost. And second, certain peaks near the lunar south pole experience near constant sunlight, sometimes called peaks of eternal light, offering a genuinely valuable, more consistent source of solar power than most other locations on the moon, where a single lunar night lasts roughly 2 weeks of complete darkness. And NASA's plan also calls for nuclear fission reactors to help ensure continuous, reliable power, specifically through those long lunar nights when solar power alone wouldn't be sufficient. And it's worth understanding, this isn't purely a conceptual idea sitting on a whiteboard either. NASA has been actively developing and testing small fission surface power systems for several years now through a dedicated program, specifically designed to produce a compact reactor capable of generating tens of kilowatts of continuous power, roughly enough to run several average households, packaged into a unit small and light enough to actually be transported and deployed on the lunar surface. And this specific technology represents a genuinely important departure from how NASA has traditionally powered its deep space missions, since previous spacecraft venturing far from the sun typically relied on radioisotope generators, producing comparatively modest amounts of power, sufficient for instruments and a small rover, but nowhere near enough to sustain a habitat with life support, heating, and equipment running continuously for 2 full weeks of complete darkness. And I think that specific detail is genuinely worth appreciating, because it represents a real, meaningful technical challenge nobody solved during the Apollo era, since those missions only ever needed to sustain astronauts for a few days at a time rather than powering a genuinely permanent settlement. And NASA has laid out its plan in distinct sequential phases, and I want to walk through them, because understanding this phased structure genuinely helps make sense of why a permanent base is described as a multi-decade project, rather than something arriving all at once in 2030. Phase 1, already actively underway right now, centers on demonstrating that the core technology actually works as intended. Landers, rovers, and drones actually operating successfully. In real lunar conditions, with the first crewed landing since the Apollo era, currently targeted for Artemis III, aiming for a mid-2027 mission, specifically practicing the docking procedures between Orion and the lunar landers being built by Blue Origin and SpaceX, followed by an actual crewed landing as early as 2028 through Artemis IV, and starting with Artemis V, planned for no earlier than late 2028. NASA intends to begin annual lunar landings, specifically aimed at progressively building out the permanent base. Phase 2, running from around 2029 into the early 2030s, focuses on actually building out the base's permanent infrastructure, power systems, habitats, and the surface systems that would support an increasingly sustained human presence rather than short, temporary visits. And Phase 3, extending beyond that into the 2030s, envisions the base eventually growing to cover what NASA has actually described as hundreds of square miles, incorporating hopping drones for exploration and expanded lunar rovers, supporting a genuinely permanent, ongoing human settlement. And I think it's genuinely worth pausing here to address directly the specific question a lot of people watching a video with this title actually want answered. Will there genuinely be a moon base by 2030? And I think the honest, accurate answer requires some real nuance. The executive order and NASA's own stated plan do specifically target establishing the initial elements of a base by that year. And there's genuine, tangible progress supporting that goal right now. Contracts awarded, hardware actually being built, a successful crewed test flight already completed, but it's equally important to understand that initial elements is doing genuinely significant work in that specific sentence. The 2030 target realistically refers to early foundational infrastructure beginning to arrive and get tested on the surface, not a fully built, continuously staffed, city-like settlement with people living there permanently day to day. That more expansive, mature vision genuinely extends considerably. Further out, into the 2030s and likely beyond, based on NASA's own phased roadmap and given the genuinely well-documented history of delays throughout the Artemis program, Artemis II alone slipping by roughly 3 years from its original target, it's honestly reasonable and appropriately cautious to expect that even the current, most recently updated timeline could shift further as the program actually progresses. That's not cynicism. It's simply consistent with how genuinely complex, ambitious space programs have historically tended to unfold in practice, and I want to actually walk through what this eventual lunar settlement might genuinely look like, because that's honestly the more fascinating part of this entire story, and NASA and its various partners have shared real substantive detail on this front worth understanding properly. The earliest structures will very likely be modular and inflatable habitats, specifically because they're dramatically lighter and more compact to transport from Earth than rigid pre-built structures would be, expanding to their full size only once they've actually arrived and been deployed on the lunar surface. And over time, as the base matures, NASA and various research partners have been actively studying the possibility of constructing more permanent structures using something called in situ resource utilization, essentially building directly with materials already present on the moon itself, rather than continuing to ship everything from Earth indefinitely. And one of the most actively researched specific techniques here involves 3D printing structures directly using lunar regolith, the loose, powdery layer of dust and rock covering the moon's surface, mixed with a binding agent and essentially printed layer by layer into walls and structural elements, potentially even including thick regolith shielding, specifically designed to help protect inhabitants from both radiation and micrometeorite impacts. Since the moon has no atmosphere or magnetic field offering the kind of natural protection Earth provides us, without us ever having to think about it. And I think it's worth spending a moment on exactly why radiation protection specifically represents such a serious central engineering challenge for any genuinely long-term lunar settlement, because it's honestly one of the biggest, most consequential differences between a short Apollo-style visit and an actual permanent base, without Earth's protective magnetic field and thick atmosphere. The lunar surface receives dramatically higher levels of both solar radiation and cosmic radiation than we experience here on Earth. And while a brief few-day visit carries a manageable, well-understood radiation exposure, a genuinely permanent settlement housing people for months or years at a time requires seriously robust shielding, whether that's thick regolith piled over and around habitats, partially underground, or lava tube-based structures, taking advantage of naturally occurring lunar caves formed by ancient volcanic activity, or some combination of multiple different approaches working together, And I think it's genuinely worth mentioning that lunar lava, tubes specifically, have generated real, serious scientific interest as a potential natural solution to this exact problem, since a sufficiently large lava tube could theoretically provide a naturally shielded, temperature-stable environment, protected from both radiation and the moon's genuinely extreme surface temperature swings, without requiring nearly as much artificial shielding to be built or transported from Earth. And I want to talk about water and life support too, because this is genuinely central to how any permanent settlement would actually sustain itself. That water ice sitting in the permanently shadowed craters near the South Pole isn't just for drinking. Through a process called electrolysis, water can actually be split into hydrogen and oxygen, providing breathable air for inhabitants, and providing rocket propellant too, meaning a lunar base positioned near a substantial water ice deposit could genuinely function as a refueling waypoint for missions heading further out into the solar system, toward Mars and beyond, rather than existing purely as an isolated outpost with no broader strategic purpose. And NASA and its various partners have also been developing genuinely sophisticated life support systems specifically designed to recycle air and water as efficiently as possible, since continuously shipping fresh consumables from Earth for a large, permanent population would remain enormously expensive even with regular resupply missions. And I think it's worth talking honestly about the genuine human challenges too, because building the actual physical infrastructure is really only part of what a genuinely permanent settlement requires. Researchers studying long-duration spaceflight and isolation, including extensive work done through analog missions here on Earth, in places like Antarctic research. Stations specifically chosen because they replicate some of the same isolation, confinement, and extreme environment challenges astronauts would face, have identified genuinely serious psychological and physiological factors that any permanent lunar settlement will need to seriously account for. Extended exposure to the moon's reduced gravity, roughly 1/6 of Earth's, causes measurable bone density loss and muscle atrophy over time, requiring dedicated, ongoing exercise regimens considerably more rigorous than what a short-term visitor would ever need. Prolonged isolation and confinement in a small, enclosed habitat, cut off from Earth's day-night cycle and physically distant from friends and family, carries real, well-documented psychological challenges that NASA has been actively studying for years through those same Antarctic and other analog mission programs. And I think drawing that specific comparison to Antarctic research stations is genuinely useful for actually picturing what an early lunar settlement might realistically feel like. Day to day, not a sprawling, glamorous city the way a video title might dramatically suggest, but something considerably closer to a small, tightly knit, highly specialized research outpost, focused heavily on science, engineering, and genuinely essential survival. Infrastructure, gradually expanding in size and capability over years and likely decades, rather than springing into existence as a fully formed settlement all at once. And I want to spend a moment on the broader international and commercial context here too, because this isn't purely a NASA-only story either. The original Artemis plan included a small lunar orbiting station called Gateway, intended as a waypoint and staging area, with international partners including Canada and Japan planning to contribute components. And NASA's recent strategic shift specifically paused Gateway's development, choosing instead to redirect resources more directly toward the surface base itself, repurposing applicable Gateway-related equipment and existing international partner commitments into the revised plan. And this points to something genuinely important about how this entire effort has evolved. NASA has increasingly leaned on commercial partnerships, SpaceX and Blue Origin, both developing separate human landing systems, Firefly and other companies handling robotic delivery missions, rather than building every single piece of hardware entirely in-house the way NASA did during the Apollo era. And that specific shift reflects a broader ongoing transformation in how space exploration actually gets funded and executed today, with private companies increasingly sharing both the cost and the risk alongside government agencies. And separately, it's genuinely worth understanding that the United States isn't the only country actively pursuing lunar surface ambitions either. China has its own active lunar exploration program with its own stated long-term goals for eventual crewed missions and a potential research station near the lunar South Pole, meaning this entire effort exists within a genuinely competitive global context, not simply a single country's isolated independent project. And I think that competitive dynamic is honestly part of why the current pace of announcements and contracts has accelerated as much as it genuinely has over just the past year or so. And I want to bring this all together now with an honest, balanced summary, because I think that's genuinely more useful than either uncritical excitement or dismissive skepticism. Real, tangible progress toward a permanent lunar settlement is genuinely happening right now in 2026, a successful crewed test flight around the moon, real contracts awarded to real companies actively building real hardware, and a detailed phased roadmap extending out through the 2030s. The 2030 target specifically refers to the initial elements of a base beginning to take shape: landers, rovers, early habitat components, rather than a fully realized, continuously inhabited lunar city. Given the Artemis program's well-documented history of schedule delays, it's genuinely reasonable to expect the timeline could continue shifting somewhat as actual development proceeds, and the eventual, more mature settlement, likely built partly from 3D printed lunar regolith structures, potentially incorporating naturally shielded lava tubes, sustained by locally sourced water ice, split into breathable oxygen and rocket fuel, and powered through the 2-week lunar night by nuclear fission reactors, represents a genuinely fascinating, ambitious engineering vision, but one that will most likely take considerably longer than a single decade to fully mature into anything resembling a genuine, permanent human city. And I think that's honestly a far more interesting, more accurate story than either extreme, dismissing this as pure science fiction fantasy, or naively expecting a fully built lunar metropolis within the next few years. The real story is a genuine, actively unfolding, methodical engineering effort, happening in careful, deliberate phases, building towards something humanity has genuinely never achieved before. If this helped you understand the real, complete, and accurate picture of where humanity's return to the moon actually stands, right now, hit subscribe, because we're going to keep tracking this genuinely historic effort clearly and accurately as it continues to unfold. See you in the next one.